The water is warm. He hasn't felt warm water in 10 years. He steps into the bath. Someone he trusts is behind him, holding a towel, or so he thinks. It's not a towel, it's a net. 6 seconds later, the greatest king in Greece is dead, and he never gets the chance to raise a single hand.
Today we fight not
His
just
name
for glory,
was Agamemnon.
but for the very soul of our
He
homeland.
commanded 100,000 men.
Strength of
He survived 10 years of siege warfare in front of the best defended city on earth. And he died naked in his own bathtub without landing a single blow. If that's what happened to the man who won the war, imagine what happened to everyone else. The cleverest man who ever lived spent 20 years just trying to walk back through his own front door.
Why
The strongest
did they take
man
them?
in the Greek army spent his last
Tell
night
me why the gods
alive,
demand this
slaughtering
blood.
sheep, convinced every one of them was a general who had betrayed him. Today you're going to find out exactly how the heroes of Troy really died. This isn't the version Homer told you. It's the version that comes after, and it does not end well for almost anyone. That net didn't fall out of nowhere. To understand why almost none of these men got to go home in peace, you have to go back to the night Troy actually fell. Because what happened inside those walls wasn't just a military victory. To the Greeks who told these stories for the next 1,000 years, it was a crime. When the city finally broke, the winning side crossed every line their own world considered untouchable. King Priam was cut down, clinging to the altar of Zeus, a place no man was supposed to be harmed. The prophetess Cassandra was dragged out of Athena's own temple, still gripping the statue of the goddess. Hector's infant son was thrown from the walls, so that Troy's bloodline would end with him. None of that made it into the epics people usually read. The Iliad stops before the city burns. The Odyssey barely mentions it, but the poets who came after the ones telling these stories in the centuries afterward never let the winners forget what they'd done. Greece won the war. What it lost was the right to come home clean. Everything you're about to hear, the drownings, the exile, the 20-year detour, the madness was understood by the people who first told these stories as payment. Nobody got out of that night for free. Start with the biggest name of all, and here's the part almost nobody who's only read the poem knows. The Iliad never actually shows you Achilles dying. The Iliad ends with Hector's funeral, the same Hector that Achilles killed and dragged behind his chariot around the walls of Troy. When the poem stops, Achilles is still alive, standing at the peak of his own legend and still grieving his closest friend, Patroclus. His death was foretold inside the poem itself, first by his mother, the sea goddess Thetis, and in one of the strangest moments in all of Greek myth, by his own horse. For one instant, the immortal horse Xanthus was given a human voice, just long enough to warn his master that death was waiting for him at Troy. Achilles didn't run from it. He'd been given a choice no other man in the war ever got: a long, comfortable life back home, forgotten by history, or a short one at Troy, with a name that would never die. He picked the name, and the tradition that came after Homer, the other poets. The plays tells you exactly how the bill came due. He fell just outside the gates of Troy, hit by an arrow from Paris. The coward prince, whose theft of Helen had started the whole war in the first place, and who'd spent 10 years avoiding a real fight. The arrow found the one spot on Achilles' entire body that could actually kill him, his heel. The place his mother had been holding when she dipped him into the river Styx as a baby to make him invulnerable. The one man nobody could beat in single combat was killed from a distance by the worst soldier on the other side. But the real ending, the one that actually hurts, isn't the arrow. It's buried in the Odyssey, and almost nobody notices it. When Odysseus travels down into the underworld, he finds Achilles' ghost and tries to comfort him, telling him he must rule among the dead the way he once ruled among the living. Achilles' answer is one of the saddest lines in all of Greek poetry. He'd rather be a landless servant working for a poor farmer, alive, than king over every soul in the underworld. The proudest warrior who ever traded his life for glory, looking back from inside eternity, admits he made the wrong trade. Second name, Ajax, the giant of Salami. And this is a story about what happens when the exact thing that makes a man great is the same thing that kills him. After Achilles died, someone had to inherit his armor a god had personally forged. Two men wanted it. Ajax had carried Achilles' body out of battle on his own back. He'd fought Hector to a draw in single combat. He'd held the Greek ships together almost single-handedly the one night the Trojans nearly burned the whole fleet down. The other claimant was Odysseus.
He may be silent,
who
but
had
silence
maybe
will not
half
win
of
this war.
Ajax's
Strength is not enough.
and
Cunning,
twice his
precision,
talent
that is how we break
for
their line.
talking. The vote went to Odysseus. Strength lost to cleverness. And Ajax, who'd given that army everything he had for 10 straight years, was told in front of everyone that all of it was worth less than a good speech. Something broke that night. The goddess Athena, protecting her favorite, pushed Ajax straight into madness. He walked out of his tent in the dark, planning to kill the men who'd humiliated him. But the madness scrambled his eyes, and he mistook the camp's live livestock for his enemies. The greatest living warrior in the Greek army spent the night slaughtering sheep and cattle, torturing one ram he was convinced was Odysseus, laughing in the dark, covered in blood that wasn't human. At sunrise, the madness lifted, and Ajax saw exactly what he'd done. For a man of that world, the shame was worse than dying. He walked alone to the beach, planted a sword in the sand, point up, and fell on it. It was the same blade Hector had given him after their duel won warriors' respect for another, years earlier, before any of this. What honor built, honor also spent. Achilles and Ajax both died, while the war was still being fought, but back in Greece. The world they were supposed to return to was already coming apart at the seams. There's a detail the myths leave out completely. While Agamemnon sailed home to Mycenae, while Menelaus drifted through Egypt, while Idomeneus fought his storm off Crete, the entire world they were sailing back to was falling apart in the background. Archaeologists date the destruction of the great Mycenaean palaces, Mycenae itself, Tiryns, Pylos, to roughly the same window. Historians place the traditional fall of Troy somewhere around 1200 to 1150 BCE. At Pylos, clay tablets written in Linear B, baked hard by the very fire that destroyed the palace. Record coastal watchmen posted along the shore in the weeks before the city burned. Someone there knew an attack was coming. Egyptian temple walls at Medinet Habu, carved under Ramesses III, describe waves of raiders sweeping through the eastern Mediterranean. In those same decades, an upheaval historians now call the Late Bronze Age collapse. No myth blames any god for this. It simply happened to nearly everyone at once. So when Agamemnon's ship finally reached the coast of Greece, the palace waiting for him wasn't cursed by a vengeful wife. Alone it belonged to a civilization already running out of time. Now here's the rest of what happened to the man in that bathtub. To understand why his own wife was the one holding the net, you have to go back 10 years, to the very start of the war. At a port called Aulis, the entire Greek fleet was stuck there, dead in the water, with no wind to carry a single ship toward Troy. The prophet Calchas gave Agamemnon the reason. The goddess Artemis was furious, and the only price she'd accept was a sacrifice no father should ever agree to his own daughter, Iphigenia. Agamemnon agreed. He sent for her with a lie, telling his wife Clytemnestra that the girl was coming to marry Achilles. Iphigenia arrived dressed for a wedding and found an altar instead. Agamemnon killed his own daughter so the fleet could sail. The wind returned. The ships left. And back home in Mycenae, Clytemnestra spent the next 10 years turning her grief into something closer to a plan. When Agamemnon finally came home victorious, he brought a war prize with him, Cassandra the Trojan prophetess, now his concubine. Clytemnestra welcomed them both at the palace gates. Like nothing had happened, purple carpets, warm words, and a hot bath drawn exactly the way a wife was expected to prepare one for a husband home from. For you already know what happened next. The king, who had commanded 100,000 men, who had outlasted 10 years in front of the best defended walls on earth, died disarmed, naked, and unable to lift a single hand, killed with an axe by his own wife and her lover Aegisthus, who happened to be Agamemnon's own cousin and oldest enemy. Cassandra didn't get to live much longer either. She was killed just outside the palace doors, right after him. And the cruelest part of her gift is that she'd already seen it. She'd warned out loud, standing at the entrance, that the house reeked of blood and walked in anyway. Because knowing your own death is coming has never once let anyone avoid it. Agamemnon's ghost turns up later in the underworld, giving Odysseus one piece of advice that sums up everything he'd learned. Never fully trust your wife, and when you finally get home, come home quietly. The King of Kings, reduced to a suspicious dozen. 2 more deaths close out the war itself, and both belong to men who crossed the one line ancient Greeks considered absolutely untouchable. Sacred ground. The first is Ajax the Locrian, a different Ajax entirely. Nothing to do with the giant from Salamis. He's the one who committed the single worst act of that final night. He tore Cassandra away from Athena's temple while she was still clinging to the goddess's statue, dragging her out by force. Tradition says even the goddess looked away. On the voyage home, Athena sent a storm that tore his fleet apart. His own ship went down, and Ajax managed to grab hold of the rock in the middle of the wreckage alive, soaked, and, for one fatal moment, arrogant enough to shout up at the sky, that he'd survived despite the gods. Poseidon split the rock in half with his trident before the sentence was even finished. The sea took him mid-boat. The second is Neoptolemus, Achilles' own son, the teenager who killed old King Priam while the king was clinging to Zeus's altar, hands wrapped around it, begging. Years later, Neoptolemus traveled to the sanctuary at Delphi. A dispute broke out near the temple grounds, and he was killed there, his body falling across the altar of Apollo. Nobody in the ancient sources spells out the connection. They don't have to. A man who kills at an altar eventually dies on one. And by the time you hear the second story, you already understand the first. Remember Ajax, slaughtering livestock in the dark, convinced they were the men who'd betrayed him? That kind of scene shows up again and again across ancient warrior cultures, and it's worth asking why. Long before psychiatry had a name for it, warrior societies across the ancient world shared a strange instinct. They almost never let a returning fighter walk straight back into ordinary life. Many treated him as something dangerous, even unclean, until he passed through. Ritual that formally marked the war as over a boundary between the man who killed and the man who could sit down at a family table. Again, without that boundary, coming home becomes its own kind of wound. In 1994, the classicist and psychiatrist Jonathan Shay published a book called Achilles in Vietnam, comparing these exact myths, Ajax's slaughter madness, Agamemnon's inability to trust anyone after 10 years of command, to testimony from American combat veterans he treated decades later. His point wasn't that the gods were real. It was that ancient audiences needed language for something they had no clinical word for, so they built it into their myths instead. Read that way. None of this is really about angry gods. It's the oldest surviving record of what war does to the men who make it out. 3 more of these men survived the actual killing. Poseidon, Athena, and fate all left them alive. But surviving turned out to mean 3 very different things. Start with Menelaus. The husband Helen ran off with Paris and left behind the man the entire war was technically fought for. He spent 8 rough years drifting through Egypt and around the Mediterranean before finally reaching Sparta. And when he got there, he simply picked life back up with Helen, like a decade of siege warfare and a continent of dead men had never happened. Later tradition doesn't even give him a real death because he'd married into Zeus's own family. He was carried off alive to the Elysian fields instead. No underworld required. He wasn't the best warrior, the wisest advisor, or the most virtuous man in the war. He won the best possible ending purely because of who he was married to. The same woman who wrecked every other man in this list was the one thing that saved him. Diomedes should have gotten a better ending than he did. Second only to Achilles on the battlefield. He's the one Greek in the entire war who managed something no other mortal did. He wounded actual gods in combat, cutting into Aphrodite herself and sending Ares limping back to Olympus. Aphrodite didn't forget. While Diomedes was still fighting at Troy, she planted an affair in the heart of his wife back home. He came back victorious to find his own city turned against him, and an ambush waiting at the docks. He escaped, barely, and fled his own homeland in the middle of the night like a criminal. He eventually rebuilt a life in southern Italy, a king in a country that wasn't his. Nobody killed Diomedes. He simply never got to go home again. Then there's Idomeneus, king of Crete, whose story the Greeks told as a warning, not a triumph. Sailing home through a storm violent enough to break ships apart, he swore an oath to Poseidon. Get me to shore alive, and I'll sacrifice the first living thing I see. The storm broke. He reached the beach, and the first thing running toward him was his own son, who'd waited years for this exact moment. What happened next depends on which version you believe, but every version ends the same way. Exile. Idomeneus lived out his final years far from Crete, in Italy, having learned the hard way that a promise made out of desperation still has to be paid. Last name, and the most dangerous one to underestimate, Odysseus. The man who came up with the wooden horse, the trick that finally did what 10 years of open warfare never managed. The gods didn't come for him fast, the way they came for Agamemnon. They didn't break his mind the way they broke Ajax. They took the slow route. 10 years, just getting across the sea. Every single companion who sailed with him lost one ship at a time, until there was nothing left to lose. He finally reached his own shore 20 years after he left it alone, disguised as a beggar, unrecognizable even to the men in his own hall. He killed the suitors who'd been circling his wife for years. He held Penelope again. For a moment, it actually looks like a happy ending. But there was one prophecy, still unpaid a warning, delivered in the underworld years earlier, that his death would come from the sea. And it did. Years later, on an ordinary morning, an unfamiliar ship landed on the beach at Ithaca, and a young stranger stepped off it, asking for the old king by name. What happened between them on that beach between Odysseus and a young man who turned out to share his own blood may be the cruelest story in all of Greek mythology. That one deserves its own telling, start to finish, and it's coming. Out of every famous name that sailed for Troy, almost none of them died well. The ones who profaned something sacred died on the same ground they'd violated. The man who outthought an entire city spent 20 years paying for it. 1 year at a time. The word the Greeks used for the mistake at the root of all of it was hybris, reaching past the limits a person is allowed, taking what should have stayed untouched. They had a second word for what always answered it, sooner or later: nemesis. Not rage, not luck, just the bill, arriving exactly when it was due. Greece won the biggest war of the ancient world. In the end, the war kept the winners anyway. So tell me, out of all of these endings, which one hit you hardest? And if you want to know exactly what happened on that beach at Ithaca, that story is waiting for you next.